social movements and advocates across more than 75 countries with the aim of building a global movement to make human rights and justice a reality for all of us. For all of you who have joined us today, please feel free to leave your name and the name of your organization in the chat box. Throughout the session today, also feel free to leave questions, reflections, or any thoughts that you might have in the chat box. And if we have time towards the end of the session, we will make sure to address your points and questions. Let me welcome and briefly introduce our powerful and inspiring group of feminist and grassroots speakers who have gratefully joined us today. Juana Toledo from Consejo de Pueblos Wuxhtaj. Juana is a coordinator of a political movement of women of the Council of Western Mayan People. She is also a board member of ESCR-Net from Guatemala. We also have now EEN Meen. She is the Executive Director of Promotion of Indigenous and Nature Together in Myanmar, and also is the Executive Council member of Asia Indigenous People Pact. We have also Eunice Chepkemoi, who is a gender officer at the Ogiek People Development Program from Kenya. We have Nathalie Alvarez, who is a Latin America Climate Campaign Director at Corporate Accountability and is based in Colombia. We have Bohland, who is the co-lead for environmental education and climate policy at LIFE in Germany. We also have Patricia from Comité Cuenca Rio Sonora. She is a human rights defender for a healthy environment for water and for health of the Sonora River Basin. And of course, my colleague in the moderation today, Lara Dominguez from the Minority Rights Group International in the UK. In our event today, we intend to empower our knowledge and shared experiences as feminists and as human rights defenders on knowledge and community-based solution for the protection of lands and women's rights in a context of an everlasting challenges on climate and biodiversity crisis. Globally, corporations are increasingly taking control over government decisions and processes for climate and biodiversity solutions. Corporate capture, a phenomena we are all witnessing in our respective contexts and regions, is working to center false solutions to address climate change and biodiversity loss. This is resulting in an increased threat of human rights violations, and especially violations on land rights in the global south. These false solutions, whether carried out by states or corporations, include solutions like the so-called nature-based solutions, net zero, and carbon markets. We are seeing direct negative impact of these false solutions on our communities, and in most cases, resulting in direct threats to women's rights to land. In my context, the Palestinian Bedouin communities residing in the Naqab are faced these days with the imminent threat of losing their farming lands due to state-sponsored forestation efforts. The goal of the Israeli apartheid regime is to evacuate the Palestinian communities and empty their lands under the false pretext of fighting climate change by implanting trees that are not natural to the habitat of the area. This phenomenon is called greenwashing, a term that refers to a state or a company pretending to be environment friendly in order to deflect attention from criminal activities and human rights abuses. These trees that are planted by the Jewish National Fund, a quasi-government agency, are native to Europe, but are not native to my region. Many of these forestation projects were carried out by the JNF historically in areas where Israel destroyed over 531 villages around the year 1948, with the purpose to hide what has taken place and erase the history of the areas. Given that these trees are not natural to our habitat, they have been key in spreading fires in the past few years and could result in serious biodiversity problems in the areas in which they have been planted. Moving on our topic of this session, and in conversation with our amazing speakers today, we will hear and illustrate how corporate capture is threatening women's rights to lands, and in contrary, work to worsen the climate and biodiversity crisis. We are here to learn from shared experiences on possibilities to design solutions that are human rights based and take into account the right to self-determination, Indigenous people's rights, and provide a just and a healthy environment to women and girls around the world. Allow me now to move to our speaker, Nathalie. Nathalie, before we dive deeper into this conversation, it is essential and important to understand what is corporate capture and what are specific examples on how corporate capture is blocking effective actions and encouraging false solutions to climate and biodiversity crisis, and how would this affect our rights to land? Nathalie?
Muchísimas gracias, Diana, y muchas gracias a la Red de Derechos Económicos, Sociales y Culturales por la invitación. Muchas gracias por eso que decías de que este es un espacio para empoderar nuestro conocimiento, y qué mejor que empoderar el conocimiento de todas estas... Perdón, parece que no está funcionando la interpretación. Ok, perfecto. Y qué mejor que disfrutar de este espacio para empoderar el conocimiento de todas estas maravillosas compañeras, colegas, para que juntas podamos desmantelar este sistema que tanto nos está oprimiendo, destruyendo y pues que nos está matando. Así que muchísimas gracias de nuevo por la invitación. Bueno, yo quiero empezar por entonces decir que la captura corporativa, como bien lo ha definido el trabajo de la Red de Derechos Económicos, Sociales y Culturales, la red DESC, el poder del 99, se refiere a las distintas formas en las que las élites económicas ejercen influencia para configurar la toma de decisiones gubernamentales, para maximizar sus beneficios a expensa de los derechos humanos y de la justicia climática. Cuando hablamos de captura corporativa del clima, o en los espacios de clima, de las políticas públicas locales, regionales e internacionales, que buscan mitigar la crisis climática, esto debe alarmarnos a todos, absolutamente a todos los ciudadanos de este mundo, debe preocuparnos y debemos actuar. Porque, como bien lo decías, Diana, está en juego el presente y el futuro de la humanidad de este planeta. Por más de 26 años, la Convención Marco de las Naciones Unidas de Cambio Climático, que es el espacio multilateral gubernamental de las Naciones Unidas que se creó con el objetivo de mitigar el cambio climático, ha mostrado a través de su trabajo cómo funciona la captura corporativa. Y esto lo ha mostrado porque a hoy, 26 años después de que esta institución, de que este mecanismo empezó a funcionar, pues tenemos más temperatura global, la temperatura ha seguido aumentando, tenemos más combustibles fósiles, entonces tenemos más CO2 en la atmósfera, entonces tenemos menos tiempo para mitigar la crisis climática, tenemos más catástrofes y no solamente entonces no ha logrado ni mermar la temperatura global, ni estabilizar la temperatura global, ni que los combustibles fósiles se queden bajo tierra, sino que al contrario, estamos viendo agendas que en vez de impulsarnos, agendas estatales y de las corporaciones de combustibles fósiles, que en vez de llevarnos al escenario menos malo, que sería estabilizar la temperatura global a 1.5, y perdón si estoy hablando un poco rápido, voy a tener eso en cuenta, a un escenario de 1.5 nos están impulsando a unos escenarios de 3 grados o 4 grados planetarios. Y solo para que nos hagamos una idea, En estos momentos estamos a 1.1 grados centígrados y ya estamos viendo todas las manifestaciones, todo lo que se ha generado con la crisis climática. Estamos viviendo incendios, estamos viviendo montones de derrumbes, estamos viviendo muchísimas catástrofes climáticas que están haciendo que se pierda biodiversidad y que también se pierda vidas humanas. Bueno, las manifestaciones de la captura corporativa, como tú lo mencionabas, son la manipulación que hacen las corporaciones a las comunidades, de las comunidades. Estos ejemplos pueden ser la manipulación que hacen no solamente con sus discursos, mostrándonos una cara verde de todos sus planes, sino también cuando entran a una comunidad quieren continuar con un plan de minería, un plan de fracking, y engañan a la comunidad, la manipulan, ofrecen un montón de cosas y además de eso se pasan procesos como el proceso de consulta previa con las comunidades. También hacen diplomacia económica, entonces ofrecen dinero para ganar favores, hacen una interferencia en el sistema judicial y esto lo hemos visto gravemente en muchísimos casos en los que hasta el día de hoy, después de 20, 30 años de una transnacional de combustibles fósiles haber causado daños no solamente a la biodiversidad, a los ríos, al planeta, sino también a las personas, a las vidas humanas, a la salud, pues hasta ahora las personas ni las comunidades no han visto justicia porque los sistemas jurídicos están amañados a las necesidades de las corporaciones. La interferencia política y legislativa que hace tanto a nivel, como decíamos, regional, local, y también en los espacios multilaterales internacionales. La privatización de los servicios de seguridad pública, entonces privatización del agua, privatización de la energía, privatización de todos estos otros servicios que deberían ser servicios democráticos que deberían estar al servicio y en manos de las personas, de las comunidades. También existen las puertas giratorias cuando tenemos, por ejemplo, CEOs de corporaciones que después pasan a ser partes de los gobiernos o que pasan a servir también en las delegaciones que van de los gobiernos a las negociaciones de cambio climático. La construcción de narrativas, que esto lo vamos a ver un poco más, pero construcción de las narrativas que muestran cómo supuestamente están abordando la crisis climática y cómo ellos le están haciendo frente a la crisis climática, pero realmente es solamente una forma de lavar o lavado verde, de lavar su cara para mantener su estructura económica y mantener su negocio y mantener llenando sus bolsillos de dinero y pues mantener a su junta directiva feliz. Tenemos asimismo la captura de instituciones académicas y esto lastimosamente es algo muy común de muchísimas corporaciones que invierten un montón de dinero en instituciones académicas que tienen renombre, universidades, Princeton, MIT, y lo que logran es que esas instituciones saquen reportes científicos que validan las posiciones de las corporaciones. Entonces son reportes amañados a las corporaciones. Y pues aquí predomina la lógica del poder por el poder y del poder para el beneficio individual, ¿no? Las negociaciones del clima, como lo decíamos, son un claro ejemplo de esta práctica, porque durante muchísimos años las corporaciones, especialmente corporaciones de combustibles fósiles, que son las mayores responsables por la crisis climática que estamos viviendo hoy, ocultaron datos, negaron la ciencia y después empezaron a financiar el negacionismo. Después de esto, ya cuando era imposible negar la crisis climática, empezaron a financiar campañas de el lavado verde, de la distracción de la acción climática y específicamente campañas que hacen que la lucha no sea, que no pensemos en que esto es un tema global, un tema en el que tenemos que cambiar el sistema capitalista que está en mano de un 1% y que se favorece de ese sistema, sino que hagan pensar que es una lucha individual. Soy yo guardando los papeles que daño, soy yo comiendo mejor, o sea, que sea una lucha individual cuando realmente estamos hablando de corporaciones, de las corporaciones de combustibles fósiles que son responsables del más del 75% de los combustibles fósiles, perdón, de los gases de efecto invernadero. Después, durante años las corporaciones han financiado firmas de cabildeo para entorpecer, obstruir e influenciar las negociaciones del clima. Tenemos un reporte que salió el año pasado que muestra cómo de cada persona de la sociedad civil que va a las negociaciones de cambio climático, por cada persona hay 2 personas que están haciendo cabildeo en favor de las corporaciones. Entonces tenemos que las delegaciones de las corporaciones de combustibles fósiles y otras corporaciones como los agronegocios, que son las grandes contaminadoras que las conocemos así, realmente son delegaciones muchísimo más grandes que, por ejemplo, la delegación de un país, por ejemplo, en Centroamérica. Durante años las corporaciones han financiado firmas de cabildeo para entorpecer, obstruir y para influenciar las negociaciones del clima. Y por eso hemos visto, por ejemplo, que las negociaciones del clima han tomado rutas hacia, por ejemplo, hablar de mercados de carbono. Y tenemos aquí hace un par de años, Shell, por ejemplo, el director de Shell dijo, sí, nosotros trabajamos para que saliera, en las negociaciones salieran los mercados de carbono y seguimos en esa ruta. Entonces, logran influenciar a ese punto. Y bueno, ahora que la emergencia climática es innegable, la estrategia es utilizar ese argumento para impulsar falsas soluciones que solo les benefician a ellos, de nuevo para mantener su infraestructura económica a través de mercados de carbono, geoingeniería, economías verdes, agricultura climáticamente inteligente, soluciones basadas en la naturaleza, que todo esto tiene nombres bonitos, o por ejemplo el cero neto, pero que realmente cuando logramos descifrar qué hay detrás de estas narrativas engañosas, pues son falsas promesas que nos llevan de nuevo a un mundo que nos va a sobrepasar de más de 3 grados centígrados. Y que realmente no dejan los combustibles fósiles bajo tierra, no logran justicia para los pueblos y no logran que realmente logremos cambiar el sistema y desmantelar el sistema que tanto nos está oprimiendo y que mantiene y que está quemando nuestra posibilidad de estar viviendo en este planeta. Las promesas bueno, ¿qué es el cero neto? El cero neto, como lo hemos escuchado ya por varios meses, sino todo el año pasado, son estas promesas que están haciendo muchísimos países, así como también muchísimas corporaciones que están diciendo, vamos a lograr cero neto para el 2030, o vamos a lograr cero neto para el 2050. Esas son promesas de acciones futuras, hipotéticas y con falsas soluciones que mágicamente salvarán el planeta. Porque el argumento es que en el futuro se tomarán acciones para el 2030, para el 2050, cuando estamos hablando que hoy estamos viviendo a 1.1 y que en esta década vamos a llegar a sobrepasar el 1.5 y que eso nos va a llevar a unos puntos de no retorno en los que el planeta no va a lograr nivelar la temperatura global y que va a haber muchísima tragedia humana. Entonces se tomarán acciones drásticas en el futuro, pero nunca para dejar los combustibles fósiles bajo tierra. Siempre son para crear formas de las soluciones que ni siquiera existen hoy. Y pues lastimosamente el COVID, la pandemia, impulsó todas estas acciones de reactivación económica que están centradas en el extractivismo. Además de eso, tenemos la guerra, que fuera de las declaraciones de que Europa acelerará la transición energética, lo que está haciendo es estimulando la industria de los combustibles fósiles. Entonces, ¿qué tenemos de nuevo como resultados? Pues que los más vulnerables y los más impactados, que son las mujeres, los indígenas, los campesinos, los trabajadores informales, los migrantes, se verán muchísimo más vulnerados en sus derechos. Ahora, otra cosa es que esto genera un colonialismo que se sigue exacerbando, porque yo no voy a minimizar mis no voy a minimizar cómo voy a mis emisiones de combustibles fósiles, sino que lo que voy a hacer es seguir emitiendo en la manera en la que sigo emitiendo o tal vez emitiendo más, pero otro va a ser el que tenga la responsabilidad de bajar, de reducir las emisiones. Entonces, con esto no se hacen responsables los que realmente deben ser responsables. Entonces, es totalmente una postura engañosa y muy peligrosa porque estamos hablando de cosas como, por ejemplo, la geoingeniería que no está aprobada, que podría ponernos en riesgo a toda la humanidad. Bueno, lo voy a dejar allí por cuestiones de tiempo, pero feliz de hablar después de esto en las preguntas. Gracias.
Thank you, Nathalie. Thank you so much for this very important and detailed layout of information on corporate capture, which will definitely help guide us in this discussion today. I will move now to Pat. Pat, one of the many examples on false solutions that corporates are pushing are carbon markets. Could you please elaborate a little bit on the new carbon market rules in relation to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that was adopted at the COP26? And could you also elaborate on why many consider the market mechanisms under Article 6 to be false solutions, and how could it lead to potential and actual human rights violations in relation to climate justice in general? Pat?
Thank you, Diana, and many thanks for the invitation at this important event to talk about women land rights and the role of Article 6 as a false solutions to ensure human rights and defend the climate crisis. I would firstly like to just agree to Nathalie and her analysis of corporate capture in the UNFCCC. I'm currently coordinating the Women and Gender Constituency, which are the feminist groups organized as observers in the UNFCCC. And we have strongly advocated actually also to have a conflict of interest policy. It's currently not on the plate. And I think Nathalie very well analyzed what is also the problems, because there are so many different layers of corporate capture within the negotiations, unfortunately. But now I would like to focus on the Article 6 and how this has also been captured by big corporations active in the fossil fuel industries, but also by governments, and how we as the climate justice movements were advocating within the negotiations. So before I come actually to the rules that were set in place in during COP26 and adopted, I would like to have a little look back actually into the history of the Article 6 and also where the entire market approach comes from and what Article 6 is actually about. So the Article 6 is actually covering all voluntary approaches and cooperations between countries to achieve their nationally determined contributions, so their emission reductions within the Paris Agreement, and it has been already adopted in 2015. So it has 3 elements that it covers. It covers internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, which are broadly understood as carbon markets. Then there's also the sustainable development mechanism that is referring to direct projects on the ground, basically, that can then sell their emission reductions within those markets established. And then it has also actually an element of non-market approaches in this article, which was the attempt during the negotiations of the Paris Agreement to actually kind of balance the market mechanisms, which were really pushed through by some governments and also corporations, and others that were strictly against it, then kind of brought that article in to balance the market approaches a little bit. But it has been also really put aside in the negotiations when the rules were negotiated and the entire article was put into operationalization. However, now we are a little bit more on the track also regarding non-market approaches. So why I'm saying this is because during the last COP in Glasgow last year in November, there was a big focus on the market mechanisms, and there has been also some conflicts among the climate justice movement actors, because it was a little bit unclear, I think, why there are also climate justice activists involved in those Article 6 negotiations and pushing for human rights safeguards instead of really clearly fighting against it, because we do assume that this is a false solution and it is actually continuing business as usual, because it allows basically offsetting of mitigations caused by, for example, big fossil fuel companies that are now all setting up net zero targets for themselves, so they can actually offset their emissions instead of just really getting out of the extractivist industry and business itself. So the conflict was there, but the big problem in the room is that this market approaches were already adopted in 2015, and while the negotiations that were continuing in the past years were not able to agree yet on the rules, many bilateral agreements already pushed forwards the market. So it was already seen that unfortunately this approach or solution that we don't see as a good solution to the climate crisis and not a just solution was already put into reality, or even continued in reality, because the market approaches were, of course, already part of the Kyoto Protocol, where we wanted to have lessons learned from, in particular concerning the human rights violations that we had seen before. And then, of course, we also have the different markets put in place, but by regions or on national basis. So it's an approach that is pushed on really different levels. And therefore, our approach was, and of many other climate justice actors, to really focus on making sure that if the rules are adopted, at least they are only adopted if they are providing really strict and clear safeguards. And but nevertheless, we somehow have to deal with the fact that this is really pushed through. So just to get back to where we come from and to give an example, the previous mechanism that was in place was the so-called clean development mechanism in the Kyoto Protocol, and it has exactly pushed forwards mitigation projects, but also similar things are seen, for example, in REDD+, so in forestry projects that are showing that if there are no clear safeguards in place, human rights are getting violated. For example, in the Alto Maipo project, which is an hydroelectric project on a river basin in Chile, the access to water was at risk for the capital city, but of course also for the local communities in that area. And there was big resistance against that project. And nevertheless, it was actually put as a clean development mechanism and got finances by big development banks, but also corporations, and then also were able to sell their emission reductions on the market, so or plan to. So this clearly showcases what happens if public and local stakeholder consultations are not put through and not protected, and how it also really risks the access to land rights, because it also affected the local communities, not only in the access to water, but also to land, to feed animals, and so on. So this is just like really sad but clear example how human rights and land rights are violated through those kinds of projects. So I'm reaching, unfortunately, already the end of my time, so I will quickly only say where we are now. So during COP, the rules were adopted, and on some positive remarks, we see that that some of the safeguards like human rights were assured, and it was better than what we had, for example, in texts in previous COPs on this article. So this is a kind of positive remark. Also, that there was last minute an independent redress mechanism put in place. And this is something we have further really advocate for, make sure that if something goes wrong, at least local communities and people have the right to complain against what is happening. However, the human rights safeguards were not really put through, and all the settings for local stakeholder consultations and public participations are not well defined. So this will definitely be problematic also in the future, unfortunately. And the overall system just really underlined our warnings that this is just supporting business as usual, because this is really concerning an overall emission reduction. So there should have been put more pressure on also reducing overall emissions. And then there are also the risk of loopholes for double counting. So there are many technical details that are showing that really a big interest was put through that this is making business as usual possible. There was even an attempt from business to really clearly support the protection of human rights, to make sure that at least the overall system is getting through. And I think this is something that we really have to carefully watch now on how it is put into practice. And even more important, really go back and make sure that we really advocate that we have different solutions in mind for the climate, against the climate crisis, that we want the financing not for big corporations and their offsetting, but really for feminist solutions on the ground, for solutions that are already put in place in indigenous communities, and really make sure that human rights violations are clearly communicated so that we can stop projects before they cause more harms. I will leave it at that. Apologies for running over time, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Pat, for this elaboration on Article 6 and also the elaboration on the need to have very strict follow-up on human rights and safeguarding policies for different markets and the importance of that to maintain human rights and reduce possible violations of human rights. I will move now to EE. EE, in Asia, do you see indigenous women's rights to land being impacted by corporates or elites influencing solutions to climate and biodiversity crisis? And how does this play out in the context of nature-based solution? And also, why do you think the right to self-determination and the right to lands are considered important for climate justice and biodiversity protection? EE?
Yes, thank you. I would like to echo one of the indigenous women leader, Naga Women Union from India, who is also a global indigenous fellow for biodiversity under GFSGP. She said, "We believe that if we take care of our land will take care of us. We bring wisdom from the past for the present and future for our next generation. We believe in the spirit of the unseen. This allows us to maintain a balance with nature and the ecosystem, and it influences our values. It is all about relationship with nature. It's not about economic value, but about our spirituality and our cultural development." In Asia, as of October 2021, protected area cover cycle 15.37% of the region. Together, over 1 billion people either currently live in this protected area or in area of high importance for biodiversity conservation in the region. 115 million people live within protected area, while a further 59.2 million live in non-protected biodiverse area covering an additional 23.8% of the region. This accounts for 23.3% of the region population and highlight the extent to which people and biodiversity overlap. While exclusionary protected areas are often the most celebrated approach to meeting global conservation goals, evidence shows that when taken together, the territory and area governed, managed, and conserved by indigenous people and local community are the dominant form of conserving and sustainably governing common. These communities invest an average of USD 3.57 per hectare, globally representing nearly USD 5 billion annually and equivalent to 1/4 of the combined worldwide conservation spending by government, donor, foundation, and non-government organization in the management, restoration, and preservation of the natural resource system that they rely on. This makes indigenous people and local community conservation leaders in their own right, even as they fight for space at the decision-making table. Recently, in COP26 of United Nations Convention on Climate Change, they highlighted on nature-based solution, which is defined as action to protect, sustainably manage, and restore nature and modify ecosystem that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefit. When saying about nature-based solution, forests are one of the best examples of nature-based solution. And again, in COP15 of strategy under Convention on Biological Diversity, they are projected to build on strategic plan for biodiversity with the framework for living in harmony with nature by 2050. Biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and wisely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering benefit essential for all people. Looking at all of these targets and the role of indigenous people, I would like to now highlight again the role of indigenous women. Among 260 million indigenous people living in Asia, a safe estimate is that indigenous women make up 50% of this population. We indigenous women are the key practitioner, innovator, and holder of indigenous knowledge relating to our traditional livelihood. The forest we care, the biodiversity that we rely on, everything is crucial for us. And we are also playing crucial role in preserving indigenous seed, maintaining food security, and ensuring the well-being of our community member. And there is a loss of biodiversity and climate change cumulatively escalate our indigenous women vulnerability. However, indigenous women, we have limited access, space, and representation in governance structure and mechanism at different levels, where climate crisis and biodiversity conservation issue and impact are discussed and decisions are made. We are invisible and our rights are not recognized nor protected. Our voices and concerns are often excluded and left behind, especially where there is a lot of corporate capture. In an environment where identity and territorial rights are either not recognized or ignored, spatial conservation target and all of the initiative on conservation are largely met with skepticism and concern by Earth's indigenous community, especially indigenous women who care for their Mother Earth. Some of the current major impediment to effective conservation action in Asia, we have to say that because a lack of secure or customary land tenure system, lack of recognition of indigenous people as a distinct group and our diverse identity, exclusion of indigenous and local system of traditional governance, knowledge, stewardship, and sustainable practices while favoring Western form of conservation, bias and colonial perception of indigenous people and local community as adjuncts to external form of conservation rather than leader and owner of a conservation agenda in their own right on their customary territory. Lack of political will to implement customary institutional reform. Lack of finance for indigenous and local organizations doing critical work to secure tenure right, advocate for reform, and build the enabling condition for transformative change. Therefore, there is a huge need to effectively and equitably mitigate climate change and biodiversity loss. New conservation modalities are needed to end exclusionary approaches, embrace human rights-based strategy, and advance the recognition of the land, forest, water, and territorial rights of indigenous people and local community, who customarily own over half of the world land. We further demonstrate that all the vision and target under climate change and biodiversity conservation will not be realized by excluding people from it. Conservation outcomes are stronger when indigenous people and local community have the autonomy to make decisions and when customary institutions can regulate tenure as a part of our governance. Operationalizing human rights-based approach requires strengthening the governance regime of indigenous people and local community by reinforcing and recognizing rights and ownership over territory. This also requires the recognition of indigenous people within nation state more broadly. And as a recommendation, I would like to highlight for indigenous women rights as our indigenous women role and contribution should be widely recognized and promoted with our free, prior, and informed consent in line with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. There should have meaningful representation and participation of indigenous women in action related to climate change and biodiversity conservation. There should have strengthened and support advocacy and lobbying for indigenous women rights, including right of indigenous persons with disability at national, regional, and global level. There is a need to have more research and documentation on indigenous women as repository of traditional knowledge and using this evidence-based documentation towards policy reform for indigenous women and women leadership at all levels. Special recommendation would like to provide to private sector and investor. Whenever participating in a multilateral, multi-stakeholder initiative or process, acknowledge power asymmetric, help prevent conflict of interest and ensure that community rights are not confused with corporate interests. Refrain from mobilizing state or private security personnel in addressing conflict with community. Compliant to land rights standard principle, including FPIC, are adhered to at all levels, from those in leadership position to the personnel working at the community level, and assess using community-based monitoring finding wherever available. Community-led conservation is favored and supported through direct allocation of resources to community. Grievance and redress mechanisms are set up to address current and past abuses. More information and case study and more about indigenous women and their struggle and their current approaches can be learned from reconciling conservation and global biodiversity goal with community land right in Asia, a publication published in this year, February 2022, as well as more information from AIPP network or org about our indigenous women. Thank you very much.
Thank you, AE, for sharing part of the wisdom and knowledge by the indigenous people, and especially women in this context. And thank you also for laying out very important recommendation in this regard. So we have heard from Nathalie on corporate capture and the negative impact of corporate capture on climate crisis. We have heard about greenwashing that is used by corporate capture and the control of different government bodies, academia, and judicial systems. We have heard from Pat about the development within COPs and also on the importance of safeguarding policies and that are essential to protect communities from any human rights abuses and violations. We have just heard from EE on the role of women for protecting nature and also the inherent cultural experiences to preserve nature and biodiversity. I will hand in now the moderation to my colleague, Laura, who will lead this discussion until the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana, and thank you, Nathalie, Pat, and II for these great presentations. I'll start briefly by introducing myself, although I know Diana already did this. My name is Lara Dominguez. I work at Minority Rights Group International. I'm a strategic litigation officer, and most of the cases that I work on at this stage are representing indigenous communities in East and Central Africa that have been evicted from their ancestral lands in the name of conservation, actually. So in particular, I wanted to thank II for her very, very helpful presentation, which I think dovetails very nicely with some of the framing remarks that I'm going to give before I turn over to some of our panelists in the second portion. Who are Marta Patricia Velarde, Juana Toledo, and Eunice Chepkemoi from the Ogiek People's Development Program. So given that we are running a little bit behind, I'm also going to be letting the panelists know when we're sort of getting close to the allotted time slots, just to make sure that we can try and make it within the time frame. And I will also now turn quickly to sort of my framing remarks and my sort of the perspective from which I approach some of these issues. So I thought it was really great to have this discussion around corporate capture, particularly in the climate space. Generally, because a lot of the dynamics are very, very similar to the dynamics that you see in the conservation context. And it's interesting because most people think, oh, conservation is a public good. You know, these are NGOs that are usually involved, these big international NGOs like the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, the World Conservation Society, big development banks. It's the nonprofit sector. We're not talking about a corporate sector. So it's, you know, these actors are going to be sensitized to human rights, they're going to care about human rights, and they're going to care about the communities on the ground who are impacted by these large-scale conservation projects. But the fact of the matter, and the dark truth behind it, is that it couldn't be further away from the reality on the ground. And to begin to give some context about the dynamics that are at play in the conservation space, I'm going to talk briefly about the history. So the history of a protected area or a national park is a very colonial one. It started in the United States, in Yosemite and in Yellowstone National Park, and it was used by the US government as a means to evict indigenous peoples from their lands and to have control over certain areas of lands and resources in the western part of the United States as the country was expanding westward. And this model of conservation has been exported out around the world and continues to be the predominant model today. It's based on the assumption that humans and communities cannot be trusted to use resources in a rational way, and that human beings are ultimately at odds with the environment and destroying the environment. It also is based on this idea of wilderness, this idea that nature is separated from human habitation and fails to recognize the communities, largely indigenous communities, but other indigenous and local communities that had been living on those lands for thousands of years in symbiosis with nature. So a lot of the same assumptions that you see in the legal frameworks that were applied during colonial times to secure land and to steal land from indigenous peoples are the same assumptions that are at play in the conservation arena and in the policies that have been deployed in the service of conservation for over 150 years now. And the reason that a lot of colonial governments needed to conserve these lands to begin with was due to colonial exploitation and destruction of the environment. And so it came from European notions of nature and European, in that case, colonial, unsustainable exploitation of resources that then all of a sudden certain people in the colonial administration said, wow, we need to do something about it. So then it was, let's protect certain areas. But these protections were also used to continue extracting resources such as logging, for example, forests in service of the colonial administration. So it's just interesting to see how these dynamics remain today. And it's also not just in the conservation space, but some of the panelists have mentioned also in the climate change space. So quickly, basically, it's premised on the non-recognition of customary land rights. But why is this a problem? Well, because the model ultimately fails. A growing body of evidence shows that Indigenous peoples and local communities are the best custodians of their ancestral lands, and that the most effective form of conservation is recognition of customary title. And it's a lot cheaper than having to set up a protected area from which all humans are excluded, and the hiring of heavily armed paramilitary eco-guards who enforce the boundaries of these national parks by basically brutalizing Indigenous and local communities who return to their ancestral lands for livelihood activities. And the only activities that are recognized as legitimate in these spaces are tourism, science, and sometimes they even give mining and logging concessions within these areas. So again, it's about control and centralized control of lands and resources, and exclusion and non-recognition of the rights of the people who have not only customarily owned these lands, but protected these lands from rampant exploitation. So speaking of this, how could this be the case? How could this be the case that there's this growing body of evidence that shows that recognition of customary land rights is the best and most effective way to conserve the environment, and yet we keep insisting and doubling down on taking these lands away from the original inhabitants to create national parks? Well, because there's like a deep-seated interest in this. There's a whole web of NGOs that are dedicated to this, and millions of dollars are poured in from governments in the global north to conserve the environment and to offset their emissions in whichever way, to make it look like they're doing something for the environment. But of these millions and millions of dollars, less than 1% of it actually goes to the Indigenous peoples and local communities on whose lands these projects are being imposed without their free, prior, and informed consent, without respecting their right to self-determination. And a lot of the same dynamics that Nathalie was talking about in the climate change area or world are very much alive and well in the conservation area. And I have had to encounter them as a lawyer. So from capture of academia, capture within NGOs themselves, divide and conquer strategies, the corporate spin machines, I mean, all of it. It's literally a replication in a way that I found really shocking when I first started to work on these issues. And I guess I'll just wrap up by saying that at the heart of this, ownership matters and recognition of those rights matters. And women in this context, women in these communities and Indigenous, as I was talking about, are critical in ensuring their ownership rights, their access rights, but also their voices and access to those policy fora where a lot of these decisions are being made. And I think that the general principle that if you empower amongst the most marginalized elements in a society and ensure their equality, you're going to make the situation better for the whole. That's something that's recognized, and it's definitely the case in this context. And so with that, I'm going to conclude the framing remarks and turn to some of the wonderful women who are going to be wrapping up the panel for us. I'm going to start with Marta Patricia Velarde, And I would like to ask Marta Patricia, how does corporate capture affect the communities in Rio Sonora, and especially the women from the communities? What are some of the ways that peoples have resisted, and what risks does this carry?
Muchas gracias. Buenos días a todos. Pues la situación aquí en nuestro país, particularmente en el estado de Sonora, sabemos que desde finales del siglo XX se ha impulsado la megaminería en todo México, incluido en nuestro estado. Nuestro estado se caracteriza por la predominancia de sistemas ecológicos. Sus ecosistemas son áridos, y el tema de la contaminación y de derrames y la falta de disponibilidad del agua se ha hecho patente, latente, lastimando pues grandemente el ecosistema y también a nosotros como pobladores en distintos rubros. Todo esto se da en un marco de una gran debilidad del modelo de gobernanza ambiental que predomina actualmente en México, que están anteponiendo siempre los intereses privados sobre los públicos y pues con la consecuente violación de derechos humanos de los pobladores. Estamos nosotros ahorita a 7 años y medio de que ocurriera el peor desastre ambiental de todos los tiempos de la minería en nuestro país, cuando la empresa minera filial de Grupo México, Buenavista del Cobre, que es una empresa extractiva totalmente depredadora del medio ambiente, derramara 40,000 metros cúbicos de lixiviados de cobre y que afectó de manera directa a más de 20,000 personas pertenecientes a 7 municipios de la cuenca. Y esto ha provocado que el agua se convierta en un producto mercantil. No solamente afectó en el renglón de consumo del agua, pero también en la salud. Sabemos el papel predominante de la mujer en los sistemas patriarcales, que es la encargada, ¿verdad?, de todas las tareas en el manejo de la casa y demás. Y pues inicialmente afectó de manera que teníamos que estar acarreando nosotros el agua, teníamos que estar pues solventando todas las necesidades de líquido, porque obviamente con la complacencia de las autoridades en aquel entonces, pues no podíamos esperar nada bueno, porque de hecho la alerta se emitió desde las poblaciones, porque ni la empresa ni el gobierno a través de los mecanismos de protección civil actuaron a tiempo para prevenir el contacto de niños y adultos con estas aguas contaminadas. Las poblaciones, las organizaciones, sindicatos y activistas, pues fuimos movilizados, nos movilizamos para tomar como protesta los pozos de la empresa, ¿no? La simulación sigue porque, como ya lo han comentado las compañeras, pues existe y veo pues que es de todos los lugares, la captura corporativa de los gobiernos. Por ejemplo, la empresa paga publicidad con fondos de remediación para decir que ya no hay contaminación, cuando los muestreos del propio gobierno nos muestran otra cosa. Luego la empresa construye otra megapresa de jales sin consultar a las poblaciones en lo más mínimo. Y se ven todas las tácticas que han enunciado las compañeras, porque utilizan fragmentar a los pueblos, promoviendo disputas, dando prioridad en beneficios a los que están allegados a partidos en el poder, promueven la desigualdad porque a los jornaleros sin tierra y sin salarios se dejan fuera de todo, y la desorganización y la falta de una integralidad en las posibles soluciones, pues provocan una serie de conflictos sociales, ¿no? Muy opacamente los funcionarios presumían avances en la remediación y al mismo tiempo nos señalaban a organizaciones y defensores de derechos humanos de querer buscar beneficios individuales, de mentirle a la gente, o sea, provocaban todo ese ambiente, pero no han podido concretar. En cuanto a las mujeres, los comités de cuenca del río Sonora, pues es una organización de los propios pobladores que está constituida por hombres y mujeres, más mayoritariamente mujeres, porque pues somos las que recibimos el impacto directo, ¿no? en esto, en este tema. La empresa siempre está construyendo narrativas hacia la sociedad, manejándose como una empresa socialmente responsable y desgraciadamente, pues con la ayuda de las autoridades locales, estamos nosotros padeciendo, pues como mujeres y encargadas, la falta de atención médica, severos daños a la salud, porque en esos 40,000 millones de litros de lixiviados de cobre venían pues allí envueltos una serie de metales tóxicos altamente dañinos para la salud, y es con lo que estamos nosotros lidiando ahorita. Primeramente, con la inseguridad en la calidad del agua, porque no se ha remediado de manera integral el medio ambiente, porque no se da la participación ciudadana en la toma de decisiones que se debe de hacer para solventar toda esta problemática, que nosotros hemos estado insistiendo en esa remediación integral. La lucha legal ha sido ardua y ha sido, como le comento, mayoritariamente de mujeres, porque pues en casa somos quienes sufrimos muchísimo más, ¿no? Las autoridades, después de una larga lucha legal, en donde se ganó un amparo, ha ahorita tratado digo, porque siempre fue una simulación, de poner una serie de instituciones públicas para hacer un plan de monitoreo y de salud y en el ambiente. Incluso el Instituto Nacional de Ecología y Cambio Climático y el Instituto de Tecnología del Agua, pues esos han sido los avances que podemos nosotros lograr con el apoyo de poder. Han estado para hacer un plan diagnóstico. Nosotros no tenemos una total confianza por esa captura corporativa de los gobiernos, ¿verdad? También hemos participado las mujeres en las consultas para la modificación de las leyes, tanto de la ley del agua como la ley minera. Las autoridades nos dan la razón. Hay contaminación en aire, suelo y agua en muchos puntos del río Sonora. No hemos obtenido una respuesta porque solicitamos una activación de medidas cautelares. Se nos cerró totalmente la atención médica y nuestros cuestionamientos pues siguen, porque ha sido notoria y preocupante para nosotros la falta de coordinación institucional. Hay una debilidad visible del Estado ante los poderes económicos y una falta de voluntad política para tomar acciones concretas e inmediatas. Nosotros hemos denunciado una y otra vez ante las instancias gubernamentales, bueno, no gubernamentales, de derechos humanos, como son las Comisiones Nacionales de Derechos Humanos, hemos denunciado todas estas violaciones sin obtener tampoco algo a nuestro favor. Y hay pues ciertas políticas que se tienen que poner en práctica. Desde el inicio, nosotros hemos tenido el problema de que se ha permitido que este ecocidio sea utilizado como proselitismo, lleno de promesas vacías hacia los afectados. De tal manera que el gobierno agotó la confianza, desgastó el ánimo de los habitantes. Y por eso, otra de las situaciones que enfrentamos es que muchas veces la participación se ve mermada. Hemos sufrido como mujeres intimidación por parte de autoridades a través de diversos mecanismos, como boicotear acciones, difamar defensores, asedios en los domicilios particulares, para que se desista de las acciones legales. La empresa, hay una incidencia enorme en decisiones gubernamentales, en la estructura política y en las comunidades. Nosotros pues dependemos de nuestras alianzas para poder alzar la voz y pues estos espacios son muy buenos. Yo aplaudo y también quiero señalar que el grupo Poder, que tenemos, gracias a Dios, su apoyo en todo lo que son procesos, estrategias, organización de las comunidades, fortalecen mucho nuestras capacidades para poder defender nuestros derechos y que podamos ser agentes de cambio. Quizás yo no tan a largo plazo, ya por mi edad, casi 65, por eso me da tanto gusto ver tantos jóvenes participando en este foro.
Marta Patricia, te pido perdón desde ya, pero nos estamos quedando sin tiempo.
Perfecto. Muchísimas gracias y pues aquí estamos padeciendo eso, al igual que los demás compañeros. Me dio gusto interactuar con ustedes. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Marta Patricia. Thank you so much, Marta Patricia, for this very important presentation, and particularly the specific situation of the communities in Sonora. I think it was really instructive about how these dynamics play out, the tactics that are used to intimidate human rights defenders, and the fact that ultimately having regulatory or human rights frameworks that enunciate or recognize rights is ultimately not sufficient, because there's a deep crisis in non-enforcement and non-implementation, and that this is something that needs to be seriously and urgently tackled in order for us to be able to get anywhere with many of the issues that we're seeing around the world. So thank you for that. Now I'm going to turn to our panelist, Juana Toledo, and I'm going to ask, how has corporate capture influenced patriarchal structures within society? How can women leaders work together to disrupt the status quo and build alternatives? Juana, can you hear us?
Sí,
Sure.
estoy.
Hola, Juana.
Hola, disculpen. Bueno, muchas gracias por el espacio. Pues yo creo que los procesos de privatización que se han extendido por décadas en Guatemala, principalmente el avance del sector privado sobre lo público, pues ha afectado directamente a las mujeres, la mercantilización de la vida y la privatización de los bienes naturales últimamente, pues ha sido un auge directamente a las mujeres indígenas que están en sus territorios. pues lo que hemos visto aquí en Guatemala, pues la democracia está capturada, solo pues beneficia a un grupo de poder que tiene el poder económico, tiene el poder político y pues realiza negociaciones encima de las decisiones de la población en general. A pesar de que Guatemala es rico, posee bienes naturales increíbles, quienes lo conocen, tiene sus montañas, tiene ríos, pero también es uno de los países que padece pues uno de los altos niveles de desigualdad en el planeta. Pues yo voy a hacer mención de algunos territorios que están en resistencia, en donde la mayoría pues están mujeres. Principalmente voy a empezar con el reciente caso que se dio el año pasado en el Estor Izabal del 2021, en donde pues ahí es claramente la conexión que se tiene del gobierno y empresa, en donde pues ahí a pesar de que la empresa Solway ya no podía trabajar, pero siguió trabajando. Y pues a pesar de la lucha de las comunidades que dijeron que era ilegal, que no se estaba respetando el consentimiento libre, previo, informado de las comunidades, siguió operando. Y es donde ahí salen las mujeres en defensa del agua, de la tierra, y muchas mujeres manifestaron que la tierra se les ha quitado, porque las empresas tienen tanto poder, tienen tanta influencia, tienen dinero para comprar. Entonces han despojado a las mujeres de sus tierras, de los ríos, contaminan los nacimientos de los ríos, quitan las tierras, las contaminan, y pues prácticamente las mujeres ya no tienen dónde ir a traer agua, digamos, agua no contaminada. La tierra se vuelven desérticas. Entonces es donde ahí también como es que las empresas influyen en estas consecuencias o influyen también en el cambio climático. Tal es el caso, lo que ha sucedido en el Estor Izabal, donde pues hay un lago ahí que ya está contaminado, que los peces están muriendo porque como todo los químicos que utiliza la empresa pues va directamente al río y se mueren los seres vivos. Y por eso las mujeres, principalmente mujeres indígenas, hemos dicho, nosotros defendemos los ríos, nosotros defendemos las montañas, nosotros, ¿por qué? Porque hay una conexión muy fuerte con estos recursos, porque no podemos vivir sin ellos. Pero también hay una desconexión de parte de las mujeres, por ejemplo, del área urbana, piensan que el agua viene del tubo, pues, de una tubería, cuando realmente viene de las montañas, cuando realmente viene dentro de los árboles y que requiere un cuidado y que requiere un respeto y que requiere una veneración a estos recursos, porque realmente sin el agua no podemos vivir. Sin el agua no podemos hacer nada. Nada, pero como que si este recurso también se ha marginado, lo han pasado por encima, por eso decimos que la mujer y el agua como que si también son la misma situación, porque sufren muchas cosas. Eso también en el caso del río Cabón y Ogiek también en Alta Verapaz. Eso también hay otra lucha de las mujeres. Las mujeres dicen, nosotros tenemos dignidad, nosotras vamos a defender los bienes naturales porque no podemos vender la dignidad. Vamos a defender el futuro de la comunidad, de nuestra familia. Y muchas mujeres pues han alzado la voz en contra de estas empresas, y las mujeres realmente yo admiro, porque las mujeres tenemos esa fuerza, no sé dónde lo sacamos, pero cuando se trata, digamos, de violar algún derecho, principalmente los recursos naturales, sacamos una fuerza increíble, y eso está pasando con las mujeres de Río Caabón, donde el preso político pues es Bernardo Caal Scholl, que ya lleva como 4 años sentenciado, solo por estar en contra, digamos, de la instalación de una hidroeléctrica en su comunidad. Y también está el otro caso de la resistencia de Yichquisis, de la microrregión de Yichquisis en Huehuetenango, pues queda cerca donde yo soy originaria. Huehuetenango también están en resistencia porque estas empresas llegan, desvían el cauce de los ríos. Entonces las mujeres dependen del río, dependen porque ahí hay peces, hay todo lo que es necesario, digamos, para consumir, pero esta empresa lo va desviando y la gente va quedando sin el río que es necesario para su sobrevivencia, porque cuando pasa el río la tierra se vuelve fértil, pero cuando ya no hay agua, pues ya no hay concentración. Entonces, esto es lo que ha hecho a que las mujeres también vamos luchando, vamos saliendo adelante, porque en el tema de Yichquisis, pues varias de las compañeras han salido a manifestar, incluso se ha denunciado a nivel nacional como internacional para pedir de que las empresas o los bancos ya no sigan financiando a empresas que destruyen la vida de las mujeres, de los pueblos indígenas y que contaminen los bienes naturales. Por eso es necesario, y yo creo que la declaración de la ONU y el convenio 169 establece claramente como norma general que los estados deben consultar a los pueblos indígenas de buena fe para obtener un consentimiento previo, libre, informado, antes de adoptar cualquier medida administrativa y legislativa que puedan afectar sus derechos, entre ellos, pues relacionados con la explotación de recursos existentes en sus tierras y territorios. Entonces, en primer lugar, el principio de buena fe requiere que se realice la consulta mediante un procedimiento que genere confianza entre las partes en un ambiente libre de cualquier tipo de represión, pero en cambio estas empresas realizan su consulta de buena fe, libre, previo e informado, pero cuando ya la situación ya está muy candente, digamos, ya el problema ya se dio, eso se dio en el Storizabal, ya se generó pues el conflicto y todavía llegan con eso que quieren hacer consulta, pues yo creo que es una estrategia también de ellos de cómo ir pues entrando y lograr su objetivo. Entonces las mujeres acá yo creo que estamos realmente conscientes de lo que está pasando y estamos construyendo un espacio en donde las mujeres tenemos que estar, en donde las mujeres tenemos que también tomar decisiones sobre todo lo que se tiene que decidir, principalmente sobre los bienes naturales. Muchas gracias.
No, muchísimas gracias, Juana. Thank you so much, Juana, for this incredibly interesting and powerful presentation. I really enjoyed how you underscored the connection between Indigenous women in particular and nature, and the way that Indigenous women in Guatemala have been at the forefront of activism against large corporate actors and the governments that protect those corporate interests in trying to really protect rights to self-determination, to land, to free, prior, and informed consent, but also to sort of bring to light the sacred nature of nature itself and why we need to protect nature, and adopt more holistic approaches to how we deal with some of these environmental problems, which was also a point that Marta Patricia raised, and which I think is really important to think about as well. And I really enjoyed that at the end, you talked about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and also, ILO Convention number 169, and really underscored that if implementation and enforcement of those frameworks was actually happening, a lot of the issues that we're talking about here today wouldn't be happening, and the environment would be in a better place, and the communities that have been safeguarding those environments would be in a better place, that well-being is connected. And so thank you for that. I really enjoyed that. I'm now going to turn to Eunice. And I'm going to ask you, Eunice, why is ensuring women's right to land and tenure so important for climate justice and biodiversity protection? How can we stand up to corporate and elite power and ensure women's rights to land and tenure? Do you have any examples you would like to provide in the context of the Ogiek people's struggle to ensure their land rights?
Thank you so much, Lara. My name is Eunice Chepkemoi. I work for Ogiek People's Development Program. It's an organization in Kenya, which was founded in 1999, and it's advocate for the economic, political, and cultural rights of the Ogiek community and other indigenous communities, not only in Kenya, but also across Africa. So why the Ogiek? Ogiek community, it is an indigenous, and they are found in parts of the Mau forest in Kenya. And they have a population of 52,000. So Ogiek means caretaker of plants and animals. They depend on forest resources for livelihood. That is the wild fruits, the game meats, and honey. Women, we know they play a significant role in community development, and they are pillars in various sectors driving the economy forward. Women access to use and control over land is essential to ensuring their right to equality, reduction of the poverty level, and inclusion in decision-making. So we know that in the past, most of the indigenous people's land, it was governed through a patriarchal system where men, as the head of households, they control and manage land. The men always gave authority on how the land will be utilized. And they were never bothered to recognize the voice of women. Aside that, when the husband even died, the parcel of land was taken over by his brothers, leaving the wife and the children landless. So women have at times been forced to give up their land to male relatives, and at times even to sell this land cheaply. Additionally, in most indigenous people communities, women do not have the right to inherit land. Remember, the indigenous women, they are not even allowed to speak in front of men. Recently, these discriminatory ideas have been challenged, which increases the recognition on the importance of women access to use, control, and own the land. Currently here in Kenya, we have a Matrimonial Property Act and the Succession Act, which provides for the property ownership amongst women. So the opportunity for women to be at the forefront in championing for their land rights will eventually enhance the enjoyment of a broad range of women's rights. Our rights to land and tenure rights must be respected in any case. But let us also consider the role of indigenous women in protecting the world against the climate and biodiversity crisis. We as indigenous women are often closest to the land and are holders of traditional knowledge. Indigenous women play a fundamental role in sustainably managing, protecting, and stewarding forests, which is crucial for biodiversity protection and to reduce carbon emissions. So to protect nature, we need our rights to be respected. Currently, we are facing adverse effects of climate change, and women are affected because of the role they play in the households and community. This has been contributed by lack of recognition of their land rights. An example is the case of the Ogiek, who resides in parts of the Mau forest in Kenya. The pressure experienced in the Mau forest from human activities has subjected them to travel long distances to search for water and firewood. These communities, they've been displaced. So right now they have to travel for even 4 kilometers to go and search for water, which pose a risk to the livelihood of the women and girls. They no longer get access to safe water in the nearby sources because of pollution and also drying of rivers due to the climate crisis. Ogiek community, we recognize forests as a pharmaceutical area where we get our herbal medicine. This herbal medicine, we often use it to treat common illness. But now, because of the destruction that has continued to happen and the eviction within our ancestral land, we no longer get these resources. So securing land rights will help women acquire more autonomy and power in their families and communities, as well as increase their economic and political power, build their sense of confidence and security. So the realization of land rights will guarantee food security within the families, because women will be at ease not only to take an active role in climate change mitigation, but also grow food that will feed the family. Besides, women land ownership will encourage them to take part in mitigation strategies, hence capping the effects of climate change. So what are we doing, or some of the solutions which we are employing? One is that there is continuous awareness and capacity building of women on their land rights and existing laws that govern those rights. Also ensuring that men are aware and actively engaging in advocating for women land rights and the role they contribute to the society. We understand that for the women issues to be actively or recognized within the community, the involvement of men is vital. So we need to ensure that we create awareness among the men within our communities. And then the integration of girls and boys in women land rights discourse, so that as they grow, they understand the family property is owned by both men and women. There is this notion whereby we believe property is only owned by men. But when we ensure that we create awareness among the boys and girls within our communities, they will grow knowing that men and girls, or men and women, they have the equal right to own the property. And then supporting of women to participate in the spaces where they can comfortably amplify their voices and advocate for their fundamental rights. For instance, the UN Permanent Forum session, we need to ensure that Indigenous women participate in this session so that they can air out the issues they are facing within the community. We have the regional human rights instrument like the African Commission session. We need to have them so that they can comfortably raise their issues. We also need to create a network among Indigenous women that enable them to be part of the discussion platform. Women across the globe, they must have a network so that they are in a position to raise their issues, to raise the solution to those issues. And then involvement of women in the community governance. For instance, among the Ogiek community, we have women who are sitting in the Ogiek Council of Elders. Unlike before, it was only a men take over leadership, but now we have them. And then we need to take advantage of the available advocacy platforms, like the use of media, the relevant institutions. There are relevant government institutions who can be of help, and also the human rights institution. So despite all these challenges, Ogiek women, they are not relenting. So I would like to share some of the struggles which Ogiek women are taking, some of the struggles among the Ogiek women. One is about the involvement throughout the case. As you are aware, Ogiek won the case at the African Court in 2017. And this was a landmark ruling which gave recognition to the Ogiek across the globe. So women took part from the start of the case to the end. They were the one who provided the evidence, that is during the documentation. They participated in the hearing, and one of the women was in a position to give to witness during the case. And during the delivery of the judgment, the Ogiek women, they were actually in the lead to pray and to lead the celebration at the court. So this was something which gave even the men strength to ensure that this is something which we have to fight for. And then women organizing themselves into groups to facilitate use of information. Right now we have almost 30 groups among us women. They have organized themselves to ensure that whenever there is any information being passed on, they use those groups to ensure the information is conveyed and received. And then legal empowerment, that is ensuring that the women, they have knowledge and know-how on how they can file the violation of their human rights using the legal system. And we've been having women who are going to report their cases at the court. That is after now learning on the legal procedures. And then on the issues of climate change, women, they've been participating. For instance, they are conducting activities that are environmental friendly. For instance, the beekeeping, the beadwork. They are also right now planting trees in the degraded part of the forest, something that was not being done before. But right now they have seen the importance of protecting the forest to mitigate the effects of climate change. There was also development of the Biocultural Protocol. So the Biocultural Protocol, this is a tool that is used to safeguard and protect and manage the natural resources. So the Ogiek women, they were in the lead to provide information on how they want their natural resource rights to be recognized. And then currently they are developing Aparian gardens that is in their cultural center, whereby they are growing herbal medicines and indigenous trees. They want to ensure that the herbal medicines they've been using within their communities continue to be produced despite what we are facing right now. So to conclude my presentation, I must say that we as Indigenous women, we have the solution to the climate and biodiversity crisis. And the government has to stop in prioritizing the interest of business and put our rights, human rights, and the well-being of people and our Mother Earth at first. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Eunice. This was a wonderful presentation, and I really wanted to thank you for highlighting the patriarchal nature of land ownership, of ownership generally, and those dynamics even within Indigenous communities, right? And thinking through that, thinking through the importance of empowering women to not just own rights, but to actually listen to what they have to say, whether it's, and in particular, you know, the experience of the Ogiek, the critical role they played both in the court case and the advocacy around implementation that has followed, you know, as well as the fact that Ogiek women are now part of the Ogiek Council of Elders, which may not have been something that decades ago could have happened, but sort of the importance of that and the importance of supporting the women and making sure that that people are listening to what they have to say. So honestly, wonderful and very powerful presentation. And of course, always inspiring to hear from Ogiek women, genuinely. So unfortunately, I think we've run out of time. We're over time, in fact, now. So we're not going to have time to ask questions or to allow people to sort of ask their own questions to the panelists. I'm not sure whether Joy or Mona, you had any words that you wanted to say to close out the event or wrap up the event, or if there'll be any other spaces where members can exchange. Obviously, there's the email exchanges and everything else, but I'm not sure if you wanted to say anything just to.
No, just thank you so much to all our panelists, great panelists and amazing moderators and the interpreters. Really, really appreciate it. And yes, we will be in touch. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining us and for this collective discussion. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And thank you, Lara and Diana and all of you.
Yeah, thank you all. This was actually the highlight of my week. So really wonderful to be here. Thank you.